in Mei Lin's ears, as bright and fragile as a thread of vermilion. She did not yet imagine the net that would form. She only understood, with the steady clarity that belonged to those who worked with pigments and history, that an act meant to heal could also be read as a declaration. The market's applause, which had felt like absolution, might soon be read as a summons. She went to bed with the image of the child's blue-stained fingers in her mind and the sound of Song Wei's cracked voice in her bones. Dawn would bring its own currents. The palace would wake, and men who had the habit of making law would fold the memory of today into something else. But for that night she let herself keep the stolen warmth. Outside, a clerk walked away with a folded note in his sleeve, and the rain stitched on, indifferent and quiet. Somewhere, someone began to speak quietly into the ear of a man with a severe face. The man lifted his head, and though Mei Lin could not see him, she felt, as one can feel a shift in weather, that something had moved in the palace's air. The road where the courier fell was a wound across the low marshes, a ribbon of packed mud that tried to pass itself off as a road in daylight and became a treacherous thing in twilight. That night the rain had been patient enough to draw out the smell of wet clay and kelp, so that every foot that crossed the sod left a brief, bright impression and then sank back toward absence. Lying the man the mariners called simply the courier, and the merchants called a reliable hand, had taken that path, because it shortened his journey by a day, and because the village inns along the marsh paid for discreet passage in coin rather than in inked promises. He wrapped the jar in a faded cloth and tucked it in his saddle like a small, illegal heart and rode toward the capital with the sun at his back and the taste of salt on his tongue. He did not see them until they stepped from between two leaning hedges, 3 riders with black cloaks and the blunt, bright faces of men who had been taught to ask questions instead of telling stories. It was the kind of happenstance that the Grand Secretary's men had learned to manufacture: a quiet farm lane, a pregnant rumor, a hired obstructionist. Lying's horse shied, then bolted. The cart that creaked behind him smashed its pole in a split sound. The first blow came soft and precise. A hand seized his arm. A boot kicked the jar as it tumbled free and rolled toward the ditch. The moon was not up. Men who work nights can read grey like a sixth sense, and they saw the jar at once, a small ceramic vessel, rim sealed with wax. A strip of cloth tied in a knot whose tail had been dipped in sap to keep it from unraveling. The wax had a dull, earthen blue in it, like sediment caught in ice. One of the riders bent and scooped it from the mud, wiped the clay with the flat of his sleeve, and there, circled by a ring of wet, the smear of blue looked near to impossible. Lying's voice when they hauled him up was small and high from being winded. "It's a store of ore, nothing but ore," he said. "For pigments. I have a permit, that is, I had a paper that says that my cargo is clay. For temple tiles, I sell to Madame Jo more than to courts." The man with the scar along his cheek, a guard who smelled of boiled rice and sharp tobacco, and who had learned how to make a confession from a man with fewer scruples, looked at Liang the way one inspects a bowl for cracks. "Who sent you? Where did you take it? Name names and we will be merciful." Liang's fingers went to the cloth and felt the wax under it as if by feeling he could prove an innocence he did not possess. "I travel where men pay. I do not name patrons." They beat him, the guard with the scar keeping count, with a pair of flat strikes that were designed to hurt without breaking, to empty memory instead of bone. Lying spat blood and still said nothing, because in the provinces people understand the ledger of risk. A man bears his own troubles. But the wounded jar gave the truth with a softer voice. The wax chip flaked. The officer pried, found under the wax the crushed blue collected with a centuries-old tenderness, a dust that smelled of iron and salt and something like old sea glass. They photographed the shard with bluntness, wrote inventory in official hand, and began to imagine a network. By the time the rider with the scar had sent a mounted runner toward the capital, Lying's face was folded into the grammar of survival, blank and careful, like porcelain. In the capital, rumors are a kind of currency that changes hands more readily than coin. Eunuch Rong kept one eye on rumor and the other on the emperor's chamber. He also kept one hand in his sleeve and another where the petitions warmed. When the runner reached the palace, breathless and smelling of salt and fear, Rong was sweeping the inner courtyard of scattered petals and had his ear set to the tiles. He took the news and folded it like a letter, carefully, privately. He came to Mei Lin without fanfare, as he always did when he came with something dangerous. She was at work in a small room that smelled of tea, crushed shell, and the faint iron of a prepared mordant. The studio had never been larger than a pocket of air, but it held the things Mei Lin loved: a low window that showed a slice of the imperial garden, a tray of brushes with their own crooked personalities, and a journal the size of a palm whose leaves were thick with pigment sketches and the names of colors like secret lovers. Eunuch Rong's shoes barely made a sound on the flagged floor as he circled into the light. "There has been trouble on the marsh road," he said, lowering his voice as if the walls listened. He set a cup of cold tea on the table more for the ceremony of it than for the drink. A courier was stopped. They found a jar. The man bled for it. The men interrogating him have orders to ask after anyone bartering in forbidden dyes. They have a list now, routes and names. Mei Lin felt her throat go very dry and very small in the way that land goes hollow in drought. For a moment she was the child at the harbor watching salt hang like small moons off the nets. Then she folded the breath back in and asked, casually because she had to keep her face like uncracked porcelain, "Was the jar marked?" "No mark, only a cloth tag if my runner's tail holds, but men talk. They are now asking after a route that touches the outer docks, a southern cove, and, worse, a route that skirts our eastern gate. They ask for couriers who take a bundle to the capital. A young man named Sun passed through last week with a similar parcel, they say." Eunuch Rong watched her face, as if he were measuring her by the changing of tides. "They have names, Lady Mei. They have directions." Apprentice Sun's name in her mouth had the weight of a coin someone had dropped in the clay. He had been entrusted with a small parcel days before a test of trust, a step on a ladder both of craft and of life-saving secrecy. There had been a warmth to his eagerness that had felt like sunlight. Now Eunuch Rong's words folded it into shadow. "Where is Lying now?" Mei Lin asked. "He has been taken to the magistrate's tent outside the guardhouse," Rong said. "They say if he speaks, he will name routes. If he does not, he will be beaten until he breaks. The riders who took him are not the usual thieves. They have an air of purpose. Mei Lin tested the word on her tongue. It was the cold arithmetic the Grand Secretary preferred, a policy of order given the color of righteousness. "Who else knows?" she whispered. Rong hesitated and, for the first time in all the years she had known him, his eyes were small with something like pity. "Only the ones who whisper to the moon. Those who sell cloth in the market and the men at the docks. But whispers carry differently when people are afraid. A frightened man will tell a lie to keep his skin intact if he thinks the lie will be kinder to the living." Lying's close capture was more than a missing jar. It was a thread tugged loose. News unfurled like a moth's wing and could land in 1,000 other alphabets. Mei Lin moved in the soft economy of inches. She thought of Sun's hands, quick and eager, of the courier's steady gait, of Jiao's face taut like leather in memory. Jiao could not be there, he kept himself on the periphery, because the world's appetite had scarred him with a lesson: to be visible was to be hunted. But his voice worked in the marrow of Mei Lin when she considered the ledger of choices. He had warned her, recipes kept secret die with their keepers, if not taught in careful repetition. He had also taught that recipes kept public die in the mouths of the indifferent, who do not know how to hold them responsibly. She had no time to weigh the choices as if they were abstracts. The palace is a place where decisions must be quick as a brushstroke and as thoughtful. The choice now was not merely technical, it was ethical and kinetic. If she severed the line to the docks to protect Sun and Liang and the provincial hands, she would accept the slow evaporation of color. If she kept the network alive, she would be asking lives to continue a clandestine rebellion against a court that was already tightening its fist. The ledger of her craft and the ledger of people's lives were distinct only to those with no eyes for consequence. She sent Sun away that afternoon. She told him to find work at Madame Josse Looms for a week, to sweat in the sun and keep his face to the banners until the rumors stopped. Sun looked like he would have run into fire for her if she asked. The small man could not contain his gratitude or his guilt. "They will call me a coward if I hide," he protested, but hearings and jails are not interested in the poetic justice of youth. Mei Lin's voice was a placid sea. "You will be safer. If the men ask for names, do not say anything. We will cross the rest as we must." Sun left with hands trembling like the paint-dusted branches of a plum tree in wind. Mei Lin turned then to write a letter she did not intend to send. She wrote it in her small, careful hand as if the letters were themselves pigments to catalogue to Jiao, the tone of ink invisible. She pressed the stylus into the rice paper and thought about how a single word can become a canoe. The letter was not sent. Instead it was folded and thrust into the hem of her robe. She would carry it to Jiao on the next night market watch, should he yet choose to speak to her. Late into the night, Mei Lin visited Liang's holding place. The magistrate's tent smelled of boiled hemp and animal oil. There were lanterns hung like forgetful moons, dutiful and weak against the black. Liang sat on a low stool, his wrists looped with cord. When she leaned in close, he did not look at her. He looked past her as if the thing that was coming had already arranged his face. "Why did you run?" she asked, and the words were softer than the sound of a brush on silk. He laughed once, a dry and ridiculous sound. "There is no reason for being honest when a man can be paid to lie better." His voice was stunned into economy. "I do what keeps my boys fed." The jar was for Madame Jo. "She paid well, that is the truth I tell. If I tell more, the magistrate will be satisfied. If I tell less, they will be displeased. I chose. It is a strange thing to watch memory contract into pragmatic bones. Lying secrets were not his own. They belonged to the places that had paid him, and to the men who had hired him, and to the very hunger that sat like a thin ghost behind his eyes. Mei Lin could have reached for his hand. Instead, she folded her own fingers into a cup and left him the cup of tea she had carried. It was an offering of warmth, because some acts have the dignity of warmth. When Liang finally spoke, the sound had the thin, brittle tone of someone who has been forced to trade days for months. "They took my bag. They found the jar. They asked me to name names. I thought of my boys. I named a dock worker. I named a rote. I named a man who trades in temple tiles. I gave them a name near the eastern gate, because it was a name I could borrow. They asked for more, and I gave them more until my words were a cloth rag. They asked about couriers who come from the south. I told them the story of a young man who wanted to be known. I told them everything men will say when their skin is thin. I told them about Sun because his route was fresh to me and his face had looked open." The fabric of the network unspooled in Liang's mouth. Not because he hated the people he named, but because his calculus of survival was smaller than the ledger Mei Lin tried to weigh in her hands. When Liang said Sun's name, it sounded to Mei Lin like the pop of a clay bead on a tray. The sound was simple and difficult. By dawn, the magistrate's scribes had penned the first thin evidence for the Grand Secretary. The men in black, readied uniforms coalesced like smoke. They moved with administrative hunger. Rumors are clever things. They learn the shape of staircases and how to carry themselves like respectable lies. News travels in palaces the way ink flows on rice paper, neat, careful, and then seep beyond the edge. The Grand Secretary's men were already piecing together a pattern that could be framed as sedition. A courier here, a parcel there, a young apprentice glimpsed in the outer market. They began to plot a net that could ensnare not only tradesmen, but also those who served the emperor with brushes in their hands. Mei Lin's choices were no longer simply about pigments. They were a ledger of decisions that would ripple from dock to kiln, from village to palace. She called a quiet meeting in Jiao's workshop, though he was not yet present. The place smelled of frit and iron, of salt and ash, a smell that spoke of long labor and longer regrets. Sun came because he had nowhere else to hide. He sat on a low bench, his knees close to his chest like a boy shivering. Mei Lin placed her palm on his head in the manner of a teacher, a touch that knelt everything else into a single thing: care. "You must learn to keep a face like the river keeps stones," she said. "If they accuse you and you know nothing, then say nothing. If they try to pin you, do not give them the pleasure of a confession. Silence can be armor as much as lie." Sun's mouth worked. He had been taught to want applause, and now the palace could not hear the piano. Its strings had been loosened by fear. "What will we do about the jar? About the men on the road?" he asked. "We will decide with our heads as much as with our art," Mei Lin replied. "If we cut off the supply for a season, will the recipes survive? If we keep the threads, will we ask more hands to risk themselves to things that are not yet safe? The questions are the same the world asks in times of famine: starve to save or feed to risk." Jiao appeared as if from a shadow, his coat still smelling of kiln smoke. He had come because rumors travel their own way to the margins, and because margins hold memory in their crooked pockets. "If you bury the recipe to save a life," he said bluntly, "you bury the possibility of color. If you keep trading lives for pigment, you will wake one morning and find none left to paint. Then what do you suggest?" Mei Lin asked, the fatigue in her voice like a soft stitch along the hem of her resolve. Jiao's hands were the hands of someone who had once made a mistake that cost others their hues. "We teach quickly and quietly. We take the recipes to people who will not be tempted to sell them back to ministers. We run the vats ourselves, in smaller quantities. We stop using outside couriers until the road is silent. We make sacrifices now so that the art might survive beyond this panic." "And the emperor?" Sun said abruptly, and the two adults looked at him as if he had placed a bright pebble in a dark pool. "He needs color. We have seen what it does for him. If we cut everything, he will fade again." Jia's eyes were flat as sea stones. "We will find a way to balance the two. But we cannot pretend secrecy will protect us. The magistrate's men broke a courier and found our blood. They will look wider. If we continue to move the ore in the same ways, more will be taken." Mei Lin felt the room shrink to the measure of a single bowl. She thought of the emperor clutching a small porcelain cup that had once carried a blue rim, that small recognition, which had made her believe in the possibility of repair. She thought of Liang's face, the way a man becomes a ledger by necessity. She thought of Xun's hunger for applause, and the way a hungry person offers everything to a stranger who promises bread. There are two kinds of courage, the one that stands and burns quickly, and the one that is careful and long. Mei Lin was learning to be the second. That night she made plans that were as much about economy as about courage. They would cull the supply chain, but not sever it entirely. Madame Zhou would forge new ties with a set of women weavers who had stubborn, independent paths to the sea. Jia would break his own small rules and set up hidden vats in coves where tide and secrecy worked together. Xun would be kept from public errands and would learn how to carefully read inventories. Liang would be given a small coin by Mei Lin to buy bread for his boys. An act meant to buy his silence if silence could be bought without selling his bones. Eunuch Rong would misdirect the Grand Secretary by presenting inventories laced with the dull truth of temple tiles, while the true pigments were moved in trickles and taught to hands whose names were not in any ledger. None of it would be perfect. None of it would be safe. But life is made of imperfect acts of courage, and Mei Lin had no interest in theatrical martyrdom. Her ledger of choices would not be clean. It would be stained like the palms of an artisan who had tended a kiln for decades. As dawn paled and the palace yawned awake, the first riders from the Grand Secretary crossed the inner gates. They brought with them a list and a visage of purpose that made even the servants still. Mei Lin watched their passage from a shuttered window and felt a pressure at the base of her skull, like the tightening of a string. The courier had spoken. Names were on the paper. The net was cast wide and would, in time, retract with the tidy cruelty of law. She touched the small jar she kept hidden in her studio, only a sliver of the blue that had survived from the southern atelier, sealed under wax. Not to be touched but kept as a memory, and whispered a promise to the woman who had taught her how to grind ore with rice, and to sing recipes into silence. "We will teach them the recipes," she said, and the phrase sat awkward and lovely on her tongue. "We will make the art live in hands that know how to guard it." Footsteps on the corridor changed tempo, the magistrate's men, perhaps, already shaping their next moves, the Grand Secretary's shadow elongating like a dark reed. Mei Lin crossed back to Jiao's plan and found in its modesty the only thing she could afford, a slow, stubborn persistence. She would not be reckless. She would not stop the work, but she would, with careful hands and less noise, try to keep both the craft and the people alive. The marshal of the magistrate's tent would not be satisfied by small measures. He wanted spectacle. The Grand Secretary wanted a grip on the palace's memory. Mei Lin had neither of those to give. She had, instead, a labor of slow hands and softer mouths, of whispered recipes and midnight vats. It was not enough to erase the immediate exposure. It was enough, perhaps, to buy a day, and in a day one can save another secret, teach a single apprentice, or smuggle a jar to a coveside vat. As the chapter closed on that particular afternoon, Mei Lin sat at her table and painted a single brush of blue across a scrap of silk, the motion as calm and as terrible as a heartbeat. The blue sang quiet and true. Outside, the palace bells tolling in the afternoon air sounded like small gongs at the edge of night. The guards with the scar would write their reports, and the Grand Secretary would adjust his nets. But within the cramped sanctum of craft, a decision had been made to risk small kindnesses, and to contain rather than to flee. It was a choice that tasted of iron and sea, and the small, smoky hope of a single saved recipe. At dusk, a runner came from the magistrate. Lying had named a dock worker whose hands were collused like a man who worked rope. The magistrate demanded the men's names, and the Grand Secretary would not rest until he had names enough to make the palace's memory a testament of his logic. Mei Lin read the message and felt something like a tide move beneath her ribs. Fear, yes, but the clearer thing resolve. She would minimize losses. She would teach quietly. She would not let the art she loved die from silence. And yet there was a hook in the woven decisions. In the late hours, as Mei Lin catalogued the names she could no longer trust, and the few she dared teach, a courier from the eastern gate found his way to Jiao's workshop with a scrap of cloth that bore a seal Mei Lin recognized, a small folded piece of southern silk, a mark she had thought destroyed. It bore a single word in an older hand. The message was short and folded like a prayer, they know. The world had narrowed once again to a single breath. It is one thing to plan how to hide a craft from a court. It is another to know the court already moves to take the breath itself. Mei Lin laid down her brush and felt the weight of the next choice press, to scatter the recipes now and risk more bodies, or to gather them and teach a handful who could keep the color alive for decades. The door to the workshop was a thin thing and shadows lingered near its hinges. Outside, the city held its breath. Inside, the jar of blue waited under wax, patient as a sleeping thing. She set the jar gently back into its hiding place and listened to the palace bells. Then, quietly, as if the sound of her whisper could be a bell too, she said to herself, "We teach." A choice had been made, but the night kept its teeth. The next dawn would bring new questions, and the Grand Secretary's men would renew their hunger. The courier's capture had widened the net. the net would likely close. Mei Lin had bought time with small kindnesses and a plan that threaded the craft through new hands, but the court would want answers. The magistrate would present names. A trial would be scheduled. The blue in the jar burned like a small secret against the wood. The finalness of it was a small, bright thing. She would not let the art die in the mouths of frightened men. She would not let the emperor fade without fighting for what color meant to memory. The measure of her decision would be tested soon. A page in the ledger of the palace was being turned that would bring new lights and new interrogations. The courier's capture was only the first beetle on the surface of a bowl. Beneath it, the water was stirred. And from the street below, as lanterns sputtered awake, someone began to sing, a small market woman with a voice like the scrape of a reed, an old southern workside song that Mei Lin's grandmother had once taught her. It was a thin, bright thread. It meant someone, somewhere, still carried color in their mouth. The song braided into the night and caught in the rafters, an accidental witness. Mei Lin listened to it and, with her hands still smelling faintly of iron and rice, she leaned toward the next decision like a hand moving to steady a brush. The palette of outcomes lay spread before her like a long, difficult painting. She would choose her strokes with care. The next color she laid upon the world might be the one that saved or the one that damned them all. But the song kept going, unknowing and brave, and that gave her a narrow, sharp edge of hope. Outside the magistrate's tent, guards filed lists as if enumerating stars, and a runner bearing a note for the Grand Secretary set his feet toward the palace. The note was brief: a jar recovered, a courier captured, rotes named. The net tightened. The next brushstroke would not be only artistic, it would be political, and the painter who applied it would be forced into a decision that might end in exile, in a closed kiln, or worse and more fragile still, in a silence that meant the color would disappear from the world like a song unremembered. The night Geo opened his workshop to Mei Lin, the salt wind cut across the threshold like a finger insisting on a secret. Lantern light bent on low beams and the long table that had been a ship's plank in some earlier life. The roof timbers smelled of kiln smoke and old fish, and jars lined the wall with the mute geometry of a plotted map. Jiao moved with the slow economy of someone who had learned to save motion so that motion might last. He set a shallow bowl of water, a mortar so worn its lip had been smoothed into a small grin, and a flat stone that had held more ores than either of them could remember. Night condensed the world into fewer things: the rasp of grindstone on ore, the hiss of water on metal, and every small breath between two people colluding against Erisha. Mei Lin felt the pressure of the capital find its edges here, like a tide that could not quite reach beyond the salt-scented panes. The palace had gone pallid in daylight. At night the court's fears seemed louder, as if absence became a rustle. She carried with her what remained of her small private chest, the southern fragment sewn into a scrap of silk, a folded swatch of red-threaded embroidery from Consort Lion, a handful of notes in a cramped hand. She kept her journal tucked beneath her robe, fingers habitually curling to the spine, as if to reassure herself that memory still had a spine. When Zhao glanced at her, he made no motion to speak of the recent interrogations. He let the clink of stone on ore speak first. They began as they always began, with water, rice, then rock. Zhao's hands were honest tools. He showed her how to break the ore into hearts small enough to be coaxed open. His thumb found a seam, and the grain of mineral surrendered a faint, patient shimmer. "Quiet," he said. "The bright draws hungry things." He crouched low and began to grind. The stone rasped like the throat of a distant animal, and the room filled with a powder that was neither color nor silence, but the promise between them. Mei Lin put her palm flat to catch the first dust. It lay on her skin like a rumor. She had painted in the court's chambers where servants moved like flaccid notes, where banners lost tone and faces dulled. She had come to suspect color as not merely decorative, but as a kind of language, one sentence enough to recall a childhood, a single yoke of blue enough to unstop an old memory. The tiny pinch